The old man sat in his small room in Athens, refusing the bread the physician had at last permitted him, though his swollen gum had healed and the danger was past. When pressed by his friends, who could not understand why a man saved from death would now decline to return to life, he said only that he had already advanced too far upon the road and would not turn back. And so Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoa, who had drawn water by night and studied by day for nearly 40 years, chose to remain hungry until he was gone. This is what Diogenes Laertius records in the 7th book of his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, and it is, on its surface, a strange story. The physicians had told Cleanthes to fast for 2 days, while an ulcer in his mouth healed. After the 2 days had passed, they told him he might now eat as before. He answered that he would not. He had, he said, made his preparations. You may find this troubling. You may find it cold. You may, if you are honest, find yourself wondering whether this was philosophy at all, or whether it was something darker, dressed in philosophy's clothes. We will sit with that question. We will not flinch from it. But before we judge the old man, we must understand what he believed he was doing. And to understand that, we must understand who he was and what the Stoics meant when they spoke of a life completed rather than merely ended. Let us begin where the Stoics themselves began, with the question of what a human life is for. Zeno of Citium, who taught Cleanthes, had said that the goal of life was to live in agreement with nature. Cleanthes refined the phrase. He said, to live in agreement with nature, by which he meant the nature of the cosmos as a whole, the rational order which the Stoics called the Logos, and which Cleanthes himself praised in his great hymn to Zeus. To live according to this nature was not to live according to one's appetites, nor according to one's fears, nor according to the opinions of the city. It was to align one's reason with the reason that ran through all things, and to act in every circumstance as that alignment required. From this followed a principle which the Stoics held without embarrassment, and which has unsettled readers ever since. A life, they taught, is not measured by its length. It is measured by its completeness. A short life lived in agreement with nature is whole. A long life lived in disagreement with nature is fragmentary, however many years it accumulates. And because the wise man knows this, he does not cling, he does not bargain. When the time comes that nature or reason or circumstance calls him to depart, he departs. Seneca would later put it in his 81st letter to Lucilius, and in the 77th with great force. It is not a question of dying earlier or later, but of dying well or badly. And to die well, Seneca said, is to escape the danger of living badly. This is the doctrine. We must state it plainly, for it is the principle our episode concerns. The Stoics held that a rational being may, under certain conditions, choose to withdraw from life. They called this the reasonable departure. The Greek term is eulogos exagoga, a reasoned exit, not an act of despair, not a flight from suffering, but a calm refusal to continue when continuing would no longer serve the life one has shaped. Chrysippus, who succeeded Cleanthes, listed circumstances in which such a departure might be appropriate: unbearable pain, incurable disease, the loss of one's faculties, conditions which prevent the practice of virtue. The list is sober. It is not an invitation. It is a recognition that life is not, for the Stoic, an absolute good to be preserved at any cost. The good is virtue. Life is the field, upon which virtue is exercised. When the field can no longer bear cultivation, the wise man does not refuse to leave it. You must understand that this principle was not, for them, theoretical. Zeno himself, according to Diogenes Laertius, ended his own life in old age after stumbling and breaking a toe, taking the small accident as a sign that the time had come. Whether the story is literally true, or whether it is the kind of legend that gathers around founders, is less important than what it tells us about how the school understood itself. The founder did not cling. The founder, having lived his life, took his leave with the same composure with which he had taken his meals. And now we come to Cleanthes, who learned this from Zeno, and who, when his moment arrived, did not need a broken toe to recognize it. Who was this man, then, who could sit in a small Athenian room and refuse the bread that would have prolonged him? Cleanthes was born in Assos, a town in the Troad, on the coast of Asia Minor, around the year 330 before the Common Era. He was, by all accounts, poor. Diogenes Laertius tells us that he came to Athens with 4 drachmas in his purse, and that he supported himself throughout his decades of study by drawing water at night from gardens and watering plots for hire. By day, he sat at the feet of Zeno in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade in the Athenian agora from which the school took its name. By night, he labored. He earned the nickname Phreantles, the well-drawer. It is said that he was once brought before the court of the Areopagus because the magistrates could not understand how he lived. A man with no visible means of support was suspect. He was required to demonstrate his income. He produced 2 witnesses, a gardener who employed him to draw water, and a woman who paid him to grind her meal. The court, impressed, voted him a stipend of 10 minas. Zeno, when he heard, forbade him to accept it, whether from pride or from the conviction that a philosopher should not be a public pensioner, or from the simple desire that his student not be diverted from the work of self-sufficiency, we do not know. Cleanthes obeyed. He was by temperament slow. Diogenes Laertius preserves the joke that his fellow students called him the ass, because he was the only one strong enough to carry the burden of Zeno's teaching. He took the name as a compliment. He was not quick, not clever in the manner that the Athenians prized. He was patient. He was, above all, durable. He outlasted men of greater natural gift because he simply continued where they stopped. When Zeno died, around the year 262, Cleanthes succeeded him as head of the school. He held that position for some 32 years. His writings, of which we possess only fragments, and the magnificent hymn to Zeus, were extensive. He wrote on physics, on ethics, on the gods, on pleasure, on virtue, on the proper interpretation of Heraclitus, on the duties of a king. He wrote a treatise on the impossibility of a person living a life of pleasure and a life of virtue at the same time. He wrote against the peripatetics and against the followers of Aristarchus, whose heliocentric astronomy he found impious, and on which point he was, of course, wrong, and which we may note in passing without making it the matter of our concern. He was a man of his age. He was not infallible. The Stoics never claimed to be. What we know of his daily life is sparse but consistent. He lived simply. He owned little. He had no wife, no children, no estate. He had pupils. He had the school. He had the long, quiet labor of holding together a tradition whose founder had died and whose subtlest defender, Chrysippus, had not yet fully come into his powers. Cleanthes was the bridge. He was the patient transmitter. He was the man who for 32 years kept the door of the Stoa open. And then, in his 99th year, or perhaps his 100th, an ulcer appeared in his gum. Imagine the room. We may, with reasonable confidence, picture it. A small dwelling somewhere in Athens, not far from the agora. A pallet, a lamp, perhaps a writing desk with the wax tablets and the scrolls he had spent his life producing. A window opening onto a narrow street. The sound of carts in the morning. The smell of the city. The dust of late summer or early autumn, depending on the year. Cleanthes had outlived nearly everyone he had known. Zeno was decades gone. The first generation of the Stoa had passed. He was, in the most literal sense, the last of his cohort, and his school had become an institution he himself had carried into a second generation. The ulcer, the physicians said, was not serious. He must fast for 2 days. The mouth must rest. He must take no food. He complied. He was old. He was patient. He had drawn water by night for 40 years. 2 days of hunger was nothing. After 2 days, the ulcer had closed. The physicians returned. They told him he might now eat. He thanked them. He did not eat. His friends, alarmed, pressed him. Why would he not take food? The danger was past. He had only to resume his ordinary life. He answered, according to Diogenes Laertius, with a phrase whose exact form has come down to us through Greek and Latin compilers, but whose meaning is unambiguous. He had, he said, advanced too far on the road to turn back. He had begun the journey. He would complete it. He continued to fast. He did not weep. He did not argue. He did not, so far as we are told, deliver a final discourse. He simply did not eat. And after some days more, he died. We must sit with this. We must not race past it. The old man, having been told he might live, chose not to. And the question that presses upon us, the question that the Stoic tradition itself recognized as central, is whether this was an act of philosophy or whether it was something else. Let us be careful here. The Stoics did not romanticize the reasoned departure. They did not say that every philosopher must end himself, nor that life is a burden to be cast off at the first opportunity. They said the opposite. The wise man lives as long as he ought, not as long as he can, but the question of how long he ought is to be answered by reason, not by impulse, not by despair, not by weariness. What, then, was Cleanthes' reason? He gave us no treatise on the question. We have only the gesture and the brief saying, but we may, by considering what he had taught and how he had lived, reconstruct the logic. Cleanthes was, by the time of the ulcer, near or past 100 years old. He had completed his work. He had held the school. He had transmitted the doctrine. The next generation, Chrysippus chief among them, was already prepared. The body that had drawn water and ground meal and stood through 40 years of lectures was, by any reasonable measure, finished. The 2 days of fasting had not weakened a vigorous man. They had, we may surmise, made plain to him what was already true, that his body had reached the limit of its useful continuation, and that to resume eating would be not to return to life, but to prolong a slow departure. He had, in the language of the Stoics, completed his role. The metaphor was one they used often. Epictetus, generations later, would put it this way in the Enchiridion, in the 17th chapter. Remember that you are an actor in a play, the character of which is chosen by the author. If he wishes it short, it is short. If long, long. If he wishes you to play a poor man, See that you act it well. The role is not yours to choose. The performance is, and when the play is finished, the actor leaves the stage. Cleanthes, we may say, judged that his part was over. He did not refuse food because he hated life. He refused food because he understood that the life he had been given to live was now complete, and that to continue would be to add nothing to it but duration. And duration, for the Stoic, was never the measure. There is another consideration. The fast itself, those first 2 days the physicians had prescribed, had been a kind of accidental rehearsal. He had crossed a threshold. He had begun, without intending it, the very practice that would end him. When he said he had advanced too far on the road to turn back, he was not, I think, being merely poetic. He had begun something. He had entered a discipline. And to abandon it now, simply because the original medical reason had passed, would have been, for a man of his temperament, a kind of incoherence. He had begun to fast. He would continue to fast. The body that had once been told it must not eat would now be told it need not eat. The distinction is fine. It is also, for a Stoic, decisive. We are told that he died in good spirits. Diogenes Laertius, who is not given to sentimentality, records no scene of suffering. The old man simply continued, and then he was gone. Now, you may object. You may say, this is rationalization. This is an old man giving up. This is suicide, dressed in the robes of philosophy. And the objection is serious. It deserves a serious answer. The answer is that the Stoics distinguished between two kinds of departure, though they did not always use these exact terms. One was the departure driven by passion, by despair, by fear of pain, by exhaustion, by the desire to escape. This they rejected. This was not freedom. This was the last and most desperate form of being controlled by one's circumstances. The man who ends himself because he cannot bear to suffer is not free of suffering. He is mastered by it. He has fled. The other was the departure undertaken in clear judgment, in the absence of passion, in the calm recognition that one's role has been played and that to continue would be neither virtuous nor useful, nor in accordance with nature. This they accepted, not as a duty, not as a recommendation, but as a possibility which a free person must hold open, if only to know that they are free. Cleanthes' refusal of the bread was, by every indication we have, of the second kind. He was not in pain. He was not despairing. He was not fleeing. He had simply, in his great age, recognized that the road had reached its end, and that to walk further would be to walk in circles. This is not a doctrine we are asked to imitate. Let us be clear on this. The episode is not a recommendation. It is a portrait. We are being shown what the completion of a life can look like when it is undertaken by someone who has spent decades preparing for it. Cleanthes did not invent his end. He arrived at it. The whole shape of his life, from the 4 drachmas in Assos, to the well-drawing in Athens, to the 32 years at the head of the school, had been a preparation for the moment when he would judge clearly and act accordingly. What, then, is the principle? What is Cleanthes teaching us? He is teaching us, I think, 3 things, and we must take them in order. The first is that a life is not a quantity. We are accustomed to measuring lives by their length, by their accumulations, by what they have produced and acquired and survived. The Stoics measured lives by their shape. A life with a shape has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the end belongs to the shape. To die well is to allow the shape to complete itself. To cling beyond the shape is to ruin the form. The second is that completion is recognized, not imposed. Cleanthes did not decide at 30 that he would die at 100. He did not plan his end. He recognized it. The recognition came when it came, and it came, in his case, through the small accident of an ulcer and a prescribed fast. The Stoic does not legislate his own ending. He attends to his life with sufficient care that when the ending appears, he sees it. Most of us, we may suspect, would not have seen it. We would have eaten the bread. We would have lived another year, or 2, or 5. There is no shame in this, but there is something to learn from the man who saw. The third is that the refusal which completes a life is not a violent act. It is a quiet one. Cleanthes did nothing dramatic. He did not take poison. He did not fall on a sword. He did not climb to a high place. He simply did not eat. The refusal was so soft that were we not told of it, we might not have noticed it. And this softness is itself part of the teaching. The completion of a life, when it comes, does not require a great gesture. It requires only the steady refusal to add what is no longer needed. We may pause here and ask what use this is to us, who are not 99, who are not the heads of ancient philosophical schools, who do not face the question of whether to eat the bread the physician now permits. The use, I think, is not in the specific gesture, but in the structure of the gesture. We are being asked to consider whether our lives have a shape or only an accumulation. We are being asked whether we know what completion would look like for us, or whether we are simply continuing, because continuing is what we have done. We are being asked whether there are smaller refusals to add what is no longer needed, that we might practice now, long before the final refusal. The Stoic does not wait until the end to learn how to end things. He practices throughout his life the discipline of letting things be complete. He finishes a conversation when it is finished, rather than prolonging it for the sake of company. He finishes a piece of work when it is finished, rather than fussing over it for the sake of his vanity. He finishes a meal when he is no longer hungry, rather than continuing for the sake of the pleasure. He finishes a friendship when the friendship has run its course, rather than maintaining its corpse out of habit. In all these small endings, he is rehearsing the recognition that things have shapes and that the shape includes the end. When the final ending comes, he is ready. Not because he has been morbid, not because he has been preoccupied with death, but because he has lived a life in which endings have been honored rather than evaded. Cleanthes drew water at night for 40 years. He ground meal for a widow. He carried the school of Zeno for 3 decades after the founder's death. He wrote his hymn to Zeus, which we still possess, and which addresses the god as the leader of the cosmos and asks only that the rational soul be permitted to follow where reason leads. He lived to nearly 100. He held a position of great influence with no visible wealth and no political ambition. And when the moment came that he judged his life complete, he did not turn back. We may ask finally what the bread itself stood for. The physicians had said, "You may now eat." He had said, "I will not." The bread was not the question. The bread was the symbol. The bread was the offer of more, when more was no longer the answer. Each of us, in our own way, is offered bread. We are offered another year of the job that has become hollow. We are offered another season of the relationship that has finished its work. We are offered another decade of the city we have stayed in too long. The offer is always reasonable. The bread is always permitted. The question is whether we know, as Cleanthes knew, what we are now beyond. I do not ask you to refuse the bread. I ask you only to consider whether you know what bread you are eating and why. Consider, then, the shape of what you are doing now, not your life as a whole, which is too large to see from within. Consider some smaller thing, a project, a pattern, a way of being with someone. Ask yourself whether it has a shape and whether the shape is complete, or whether it is being continued, because continuation is the default and you have not stopped to look. Ask yourself what it would mean to recognize completion, not to force it, not to invent it, to recognize it. The wise man, the Stoic said, sees what is there. Most of us do not. We see what we wish were there, or what we fear is there, or what we have always seen, and so see still. The discipline of recognition is the discipline of looking long enough that the actual shape of the thing becomes visible. And then ask yourself, gently, whether the refusal that would honor the shape is a refusal you are willing to make. Not now, perhaps, not yet, but someday. In some smaller matter first. A meeting you will not extend. A conversation you will let end. A piece of work you will set down, complete, rather than polishing it into something less than it was. Cleanthes did not begin with the bread. He began, we may imagine, with smaller refusals 50 years before. The discipline that allowed him to sit in the small room and not eat was not invented in that room. It was practiced for a lifetime, in matters so small that no one, including perhaps himself, noted them as practice. The question I leave you with is this: what in your life right now is complete and continues only because you have not yet seen that it is complete? You need not answer quickly. You need not answer at all. Cleanthes took, in some sense, 100 years to answer his own version of the question. But the question is worth carrying. It is worth setting down beside you as a small lamp and returning to in the quiet hours when the noise of continuation has grown faint enough that you can hear what is actually there. The old man in the small room finished his fast. He did not, so far as we are told, speak again of the matter. His friends, who had pressed him, fell silent. The physicians, who had healed the ulcer, withdrew, and Cleanthes, who had drawn water by night for 40 years and held the door of the Stoa open for 32 more, completed his life as he had lived it, without spectacle, without complaint, and in agreement with the nature he had spent a century trying to understand. We are told he died peacefully. We are told no more.